Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This one's Evolution 6, classification. It's the last one in the evolution series, and we look at the concept of classification, why it exists, how it works, and the fundamental parts of classification that you need to know for your GCSE. As I've just said, it's from the GCSE specification, and as always, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you. So let's start off with the really obvious question of what is classification. And to do this, I want you to consider what a library is like. Now, I know a lot of you probably don't use libraries anymore. You probably just go straight onto Google, type in what you want, and it brings back an answer. But back in the olden days when I was young, if you needed to learn some new information, you had an essay to write for school or something, you'd go to the library and you'd try and find the books you need. Now, imagine if there was a library where all of the books and manuscripts and magazines and everything else were just thrown anywhere, put on any shelf, just stacked up in piles or whatever. And you needed to find out about, let's say, genetics. And you were like, well, where do I even look? Where's a book on genetics? If everything is totally muddled up, it's very hard to make sense of anything, to know what books go with what books, to know what ones can lead on to other topics. So you need to get things a bit organized. And when you go to a library, what you find is that there'll be a fiction and a non-fiction section. And in the non-fiction section, there'll be a section for biology, a section for history, a section for engineering, and even within those there might be a section on World War II, another section on ancient China or whatever. Everything is categorized into nice little groups so that it makes more sense and so that it is much more usable. Now for a library, that library is just being classified according to the type of book. Well, exactly the same is necessary for the natural world. But I want you to consider that there are many, many more forms of life on Earth than there are different types of books in a library. If you think back to the previous, or 2 videos ago it was, Evolution 4, when we're talking about life and talking about evolution, we're looking at all those little subsequent steps that develop from primitive organisms with little improvements for each evolutionary stage that takes you to a more advanced life form. But if you remember back from that video, we talked about speciation. This is how the number of species exist. So we may have this little creature up here, but that little creature up there may evolve and gain fangs to be a better predator. Or in another area under different selective pressures, it might evolve a second eye to get depth perception. Somewhere else, it might evolve to be green, to be photosynthetic. Or it might stay as it is if there wasn't a random mutation to give it an adaptation. So that one original could become 4. But then each one of those might in turn change and specialize and get new adaptations. So that one original multiplies even more. Or, if you look at the line closest to us, just stay exactly as it was. And that original one might still be present in the present day. But either way, you end up with a load of organisms that you need to try and classify. Now, because most of those organisms over time have died out, you're only left actually with the newest ones that are there. And those ones would have come about because of mutation and adaptation to the selective pressure has led to the evolution of many millions of life forms on planet Earth, because they all fill different niches. They all do slightly different jobs. But because we've only got the ones that we can see present day, it becomes very hard to know, well, which ones of those are evolved from each other, which ones are closely related, which ones can we group together, and which ones aren't even vaguely similar. So classification helps us to do this. So it shows which ones are closely related, which helps us to understand their evolutionary pathways. Now, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus was one of the first to begin classifying the world in the mid-1700s. He was actually quite a pompous, arrogant guy. He thought he was like the prince of botany. He thought he was one of the greatest scientists to ever have lived. But to be fair to him, he did do a lot of incredible work. He was one of the first people to really look at loads of different life forms and try and simplify the crazy Latin names that had been given to them, so that everything just had a 2-name demarcation, just 2 words that said, right, it's this kind of group of organisms and it's this within that group. And he tried to apply that to everything. That was the first major step towards the modern classification. But most of the work to how we do our modern classification was done by another Carl, this guy called Carl Woese, Carl Woese much more recently, and he was a microbiologist. He was we're talking 1960s and 70s now, so relatively recent compared to the couple of hundred years ago that Carl Linnaeus lived. He was the first one who really started to look back through the evolutionary links and make the classification that we're going to look at next. So let's look at the modern classification system. But our modern system is still built on what Carl Linnaeus came up with a couple of hundred years ago. So it's still based on the Linnaean natural classification system, though much of the work to refine it to what we know was done by this Carl Woese guy. So it was pretty obvious looking at the natural world that there's three very different things. You've got animals, you've got plants, and you've got fungi. A lot of people, especially like small children, if they don't know any better, might think fungi are a type of plant, but they're not. They don't photosynthesize, they grow in a different way, their cells are slightly different. But you can still see with the naked eye these three very different forms of life: animal, plants, and fungi. These three kingdoms are visible to everyone. Now, once you use microscopes, you can see that there are more kingdoms though. We've got Protista, which are more single-celled examples, and you've got the group that you will have heard of from previous videos, prokaryotes. Now, if we put in prokaryotes up there, prokaryotes are very different to these other ones up above me here. Prokaryotes, remember, they're far more simple. They don't have a nucleus, they don't have mitochondria. The cells are much smaller. They're very different to the cells in these four kingdoms above me. So those four kingdoms, we need to group them together with another name, which again you should know is eukaryotes. But now what we've got, we can't have animals, plants, fungi and protista on the same level as prokaryotes if there's a level above them. So it was decided that that level above would be called the domain. So eukaryotes is a domain with those four kingdoms. Prokaryotes are just prokaryotes. So prokaryotes is the domain and the kingdom, which is a bit annoying, but it is what it is. So we've got these two domains and we've got 5 kingdoms of life. However, relatively recently, it was discovered that prokaryotes, when you really look at them and really examine them, are formed of 2 very distinct groups. So although everything you learn at GCSE is about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, there's actually 2 types of prokaryotes, which are the eubacteria, or just bacteria, quite often called, and archaeans. Now, archaeans are a very ancient form of bacteria. They tend to grow in very extreme environments, so in sulfurous volcanic vents, or in high temperatures or high salt concentrations, places where cells really shouldn't be able to live. You generally find archaea. So they're quite often referred to as extremophiles, meaning they love extreme environments. So really now in classification, we've kind of ditched the word prokaryotes and we just have eubacteria and archaea, which themselves are domains and kingdoms. So we now have this system of 3 domains made up of 6 kingdoms. Now I'm going to put that in a yellow box because you absolutely have to know that for your exam. You need to know those 3 domains and how they break down into the kingdoms. Okay, eukaryotic cells are all pretty similar. They've all got a nucleus and stuff. Eubacteria and archaea, they're both kind of prokaryotes, that original group you learnt about. So they're similar, but they've got some major differences, enough to make them different domains and kingdoms. Okay, now we've already said that domains can be split into those kingdoms, but kingdoms can then be further subdivided into phylums, classes, orders, and families. You don't need to know those words. All we're talking about now is divisions getting smaller and smaller. So for example, the animal kingdom could be broken up into a load of different phylums. Each phylum, then you go, well, there's different classes within this phylum. Each class is broken into orders and families and so on and so forth. Okay, to give you an idea of that, for humans, we are in the domain. You should know what domain we're in from above. We're eukaryotes, we're animals. Our phylum is chordates, our class is mammals. You know what mammals are. Within mammals, we belong to the group, the order called primates, and within primates, we belong to the family of hominids. Now, we are the only hominid left on the planet. There used to be lots. You've probably heard of Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalis, and things like that, other human-like creatures. but they all went extinct. We're the only hominid that's still around on the planet. So this is how that system fits with us. But you don't need to know this. I'm giving you this as an example of how they just break down into smaller and smaller groups. What you do need to know, though, is family is then broken down into genus and species. So this is the most specific that it gets, okay? So genus and species for us, you should recognize our genus is Homo, our species is Sapien. Now, when you put those two together, it gives you something called a binomial. This is absolute classic Carl Linnaeus stuff now. I said before, he gave everything these two names to denote what it is. It's still the same today. Our genus and species is referred to as our binomial. And the word binomial, bi meaning two, nomial meaning name. It literally means to name. Well, our to name is Homo sapien. Okay, that's in a yellow box as well, you'll note, because you have to know that for your exam. Now, just giving a few examples of those that you might know. So to fill in human, we said we're Homo sapiens, Homo sapien. Great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias, so its binomial is Carcharodon carcharias. And a chimpanzee, one of our closest living relatives on the planet, is Pan troglodytes. Again, you don't need to know these. I'm putting them there just to reinforce in your head that you've got a genus, you've got a species, but if you say them together, that's the binomial. Okay, should be fairly straightforward. Lastly, and really importantly, we did look at this definition, I think in Evolution 4, it's the definition of a species. What makes a species? How can you classify it as a unique thing in its own right? And hopefully you remember there's two parts to this definition. Firstly, is that a species is a group of organisms that show similar morphology. That's how they look. That's the main thing that Carl Linnaeus looked at, how something looks. Then their physiology, that's how they're put together inside, their organs. Then their biochemistry, so that's basically their DNA and their proteins, what's going on inside them. And then their behavior. If you've got organisms that show very great similarities within those four things, they're probably in the same species. But the really important thing that defines something as a species is it has to be able to interbreed, meaning members of the species breed with each other, to produce fertile offspring, so that the offspring are fertile and can breed within the species and produce more, because the species must be able to continue through generations. If it can't continue through generations, you can't class it as a species. Okay, so lots of stuff on this screen. The most important stuff to learn are the two bits that I put in the yellow box, but really do try and learn the species definition as well. So this is modern classification. It's how we put things into their groups to get them as specific as possible. Right, the last thing that we need to look at then for classification is this thing called an evolutionary tree. Now this is basically like the thing I showed on the first slide with my first little creature splitting and evolving into the different types. If we'd have flipped it around the other way, it'd be like a tree growing up. Well, that's what we're looking at here. So an evolutionary tree, if we look at, for example, vertebrate evolution, if I put a little cross on the screen there, and that cross is representing the first vertebrate, so that's an animal with a backbone, as I've written over there, and that first vertebrate, the fossil record indicates, came about around 500 million years ago. Now, this is the evolutionary tree that has been constructed by scientists. But remember, this has been constructed based on the available evidence. It may not be correct. It's just what all the evidence shows. What happens is this, okay? So if you go forward through time, you can see that that original vertebrate way over there splits and branches into different types, and splits and branches right the way through. If we pick a few examples, if you look at what I put in a yellow box up there, that branch way over there, so that branched off from the original way back further on, way over the other side of the page. Look, the first split from the red cross took you up to those two species there, the hagfishes and the lampreys, which are the agnaths. Now those are just jawless fish, they're quite often referred to. Still around today. The lines that go right forward up to present day, the list of names, that's present day. So this above, that's a lamprey there. So jawless, they don't have a bottom jaw to allow them to eat. They have these weird, like round suction mouths with teeth. They're really weird creatures. But have a look at the diagram. You can see that they split from everything else very, very, very early on. So from an evolutionary point of view, these are hardly at all related to any other vertebrates. They're the most distantly related to all other vertebrates because they broke off from all other vertebrates so very long ago. If I get rid of that and we pull up a different group, you see I've circled that word tetrapoda. That's tetrapods. That's creatures who had 4 limbs. We're talking about the first creatures who kind of dragged themselves out of the water in what is referred to as the fish tetrapod transition, when fish that were abundant in the seas, look at the diagram from the early branches, all of those go to kind of modern day fish and sharks and rays and things like that. But these tetrapods were the first ones that kind of dragged themselves onto land to become most land vertebrate species that we know about. So everything within that box, these are all linked back to tetrapods, which includes us. So if you go back to the far side of that yellow square to that tetrapod split, that's when we last had a common ancestor with everything else that's within that box. Now, if we subdivide within that again, and I just circle that group down there, look at the 3 names that are in there. We've got monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. We are placentals. It means that when we're conceived inside the uterus, a placenta grows, and the placenta is what filters the mother's blood. It's how we get our nutrition from our mothers. So we are this group that's placentals. But look, within that group, we've got marsupials and monotremes, but we 3 make up mammals. Okay. Now within that group, still look at it, we're very closely related to marsupials because we only split from them relatively recently. They're our closest one that we split from. We split from monotremes a little bit further back. Monotremes, by the way, are mammals, but they're egg-laying mammals. So we're talking about platypus and echidnas. That's basically it. Australian creatures. They're really cool. Look them up, echidnas in particular. So we're very closely related to monotremes relative to everything else on there, but we're more closely related to marsupials. Hopefully that makes sense. If that diagram doesn't make a huge amount of sense to you, and if you're looking at us as placentals and you're not quite sure, I mean, looking at that, you can see placentals, we're way on down here. Our most distant vertebrate relative is the hagfish and the lampreys. But you can see as we go further away and it branches more, we're less related. So even within tetrapods, we're least related to the amphibians because they're the ones that branched away from us furthest back. But let's try and bring this to something a bit close to home, something you might know a bit better. Let's talk specifically about us as humans, but that we are a member of the great ape family. Now, there's only 5 members in our great ape family: orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees, and us. Now, we had a common ancestor a long time ago, and that common ancestor eventually evolved into us. But during that evolutionary path, it branched off to orangutans about 14 million years ago. So our last common ancestor to orangutans was 14 million years ago. Our last common ancestor to gorillas, we branched from them about 7 million years ago. Bonobos and chimps both branched off at the same time, then branched from each other. So if you look at this diagram, hopefully it's obvious that bonobos and chimps are the most closely related of the 5 great ape families. But of the 5, we are closest to bonobos and chimps as that group. Okay, we're very genetically similar to chimpanzees. Okay, so hopefully that diagram makes sense. But as I said before, these are based on the available evidence, on the fossil record, on DNA analysis, on biochemical comparisons, but really they're our best guess. Now in the exam, I can almost guarantee you, you will be given an evolutionary tree diagram like one of these, and you'll be asked questions like, say for the great apes one, which great ape are we most distantly related to? And it would be the orangutan. If it says why, it's because they branched off from us the furthest back in time. So it's the furthest, the longest time ago that there was a common ancestor. Common ancestor meaning an organism that was common to both of us. Okay, hopefully all of that makes sense, because that's really all there is in classification. So from here, what I want you to do is go onto the genetic engineering playlist, look at genetic engineering 1, artificial selection, which is a really nice follow-on from evolution, because evolution is natural selection. You're now going to look at artificial selection for how humans have tried to drive evolution to create animals for our own purposes. As always, please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Do give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and head over to my Facebook page for lots of random science and infographics that should keep you interested. Thank you.